Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Today's passage is the turning point of Mark's account of Jesus' life. It turns on Jesus' question to Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" It's a question to each of us. But how does our answer compare to what Jesus says about his identity, his mission, and what it means to be his follower? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. I'm sure we can all think of turning points in our lives. For Alex and me, a big turning point was getting on a plane to come to the other side of the world to work full-time for a church. Turning points, however, are not necessarily changes in direction. They can also be changes in intensity, changes in focus, changes in speed. It could be the time that you realise that you are really going to focus on your work. You're really going to make a go of it, doing what you already were doing, but with a new vigour, a new focus. Now, in this part of Mark's account of Jesus' life that we're looking at today, from Mark chapter 8, it's a part, of course, taken again from Peter's personal memories of Jesus, but we've got one of those kinds of turning points. What had been clear before gains a greater focus, a greater intensity. Things that had already been moving fast. Now the objective, the end point becomes clear, a clarity that we hadn't seen before. But for Jesus' disciples who've been travelling with him, this turning point almost gives them whiplash. A turning point that is incredibly important is what we're looking at today. Incredibly important for us to hear and for us to understand when we think about Christian faith. In the past weeks, we've been reading of Jesus moving quickly from place to place. Mark keeps using the word immediately, and there are no wasted words. And while he's been doing amazing things, what really grabbed people's attention was his authority, and particularly the authority of his teaching. He spoke as if he knew what he was talking about. Not loud, not domineering, but he knew it. He knew what he was talking about in a way that other people could tell that he knew. And his actions, they matched this authority, doing things that no ordinary human can do. Healing sicknesses, raising dead people, rebuking even the forces of nature. Who is this? Well, that's what we as readers are supposed to be wondering. The leaders and the religious authorities, they're disturbed by this man. He didn't conform to the expectations or customs. And so time and again we read they took offence at him. Chapter 1 verse 22, chapter 2 verse 6 and 16 and 18 and 24, chapter 3 verse 6 and verse 22, chapter 7 verse 1 and 3 and 5, and chapter 8 verses 11 and 15, time and again they took offence at him. Who does he think he is? Through all that, there's been another reaction. Even among those 12 he'd chosen to travel with him. Time and again we're told they just didn't understand. Chapter 4 verse 13, chapter 6 verse 52, chapter 7 verse 18, chapter 8 verse 17, chapter 8 verse 21. But friends, if we were there, we wouldn't have worked it out either. I mean, who is this who acts and speaks with such authority? Even his teaching was in parables. He wouldn't just speak plainly. And then from this passage that we're looking at today, we reach the turning point. After this, Jesus begins to head toward Jerusalem, and on that journey, Jesus focuses on his teaching the 12 rather than teaching the crowds. And he's not using parables anywhere near like he was before. He's speaking plainly about who he is and what he's come to do and what it means to be associated with him. And what we are listening to today is a conversation that was unforgettable. And it's got 3 topics. Jesus' identity in verses 27 to 30 of chapter 8, Jesus' mission in verses 31 to 33, and then talking about Jesus' followers in verses 34 to 38. First, Jesus' identity. Verse 27 of chapter 8. Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" Remember, he's asking this in the light of the impact he has been having. What would you think of a person who asked a question like Jesus just asked? Usually, it would be a person who had some kind of a problem. A megalomaniac, an ego-driven person. Who do people say that I am? What are people saying about me? On the other hand, perhaps someone with great insecurities would ask a question like that. Who do people say that I am? But if we have heard what Jesus has been saying up to this point, and if we've noticed what he's been doing up to this point, we'd recognise that he's not asking for those reasons. Jesus is no egoist, and he's not insecure either. Jesus asks this question because until you recognise who he is, then you cannot possibly understand what it means to follow him. You can't understand what it means to be a Christian. Jesus Christ is different to the other teachers that this world has known. And the world has known a great many teachers, and by and large, who they were doesn't really matter at all, does it? It's their teaching that matters, not their identity. Think of teachers in the last couple of 100 years. Karl Marx. It doesn't really matter who he was, it was his ideas that he taught. That's what mattered. That's what had the impact. I mean, you don't really need to know about the man Karl Marx to understand his teaching. Einstein emerges with a new teaching about the nature of the universe and how it works. But it doesn't really matter who he is. It's what he taught, his new ideas. That was what was mattered. Someone like Robert Jordan, he questions modern trends in thinking about humanity, but it's his ideas, it's his thoughts, even his rediscovery and representation of ancient philosophers. That's what matters. And other top podcasters are much the same, whether it's Joe Rogan or Trevor Noah or The Rest is History or The Rest is Politics. The way they engage with ideas, that's what grabs our attention. But with Jesus, it is not so much his teaching that distinguishes him, although that certainly does matter, but it only matters because of who he is. With others, it's the teaching that gives their identity significance. But with Jesus, it is his identity that gives his teaching significance. So Jesus raises the question in that conversation, who do people say that I am? It has many possible answers. And one of the striking things in this passage is the kind of thing that the disciples around Jesus say. The possibilities that were on the minds of Jesus' contemporaries are not the kinds of possibilities that people would think about today in answering that question. I mean, what do people say about Jesus in our day? If they think about him at all, what do they say? Well, they say he was a good man. But no one in Jesus' day who actually met him said that. Our neighbours and friends might say, oh, he was one of those great religious leaders of history. But no one in Jesus' day thought that. They just didn't think that would explain him at all. One of our neighbours just told me the other day that she had a spiritual vision of Jesus as she led a Reiki healing group, and that I must have had many experiences like that, light radiating from his heart and his palms open. But no one who met the real Jesus would ever have described him like that. Look at verse 28. See what they were saying about him in his own day. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. I wonder if you noticed how odd those options are. I mean, all the people they mention are dead. When people tried to work out who Jesus was in his own day, the sort of possibilities they thought of was that he was like someone from the past who'd come back to life again. Someone from the recent past, John the Baptist, who had only been recently beheaded. or the more distant past, Elijah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, one of the other prophets, but come back. The impact that Jesus made on his contemporaries was such that they had to believe that God was really doing something extraordinary, like bringing back from the dead one of the greatest heroes of their past. And if that was the case, it meant that God was about to do something significant. That was one of their guesses. Not that they knew for sure, but that was one of the guesses. But when they said, "Who is this?" that's the kind of possibility that came into their mind in Jesus' own day. But Jesus, you'll notice, isn't satisfied with those answers. So he says in verse 29 to his disciples, "Well, what about you? Who do you say that I am?" You see, Jesus is not satisfied. Those answers that the society was giving about him were inadequate. But more, he's not going to leave it at the level of what other people say. See, this question is far too important. It's far too important than mere public opinion. And we can't leave Jesus at the level of what do other people say about him. The question has to be put to us individually. Who do you say that Jesus is? Have you come to a conclusion on that? What is your opinion on the question of who Jesus is? That's an important thing for our colleagues to grapple with as well, isn't it? Not just what does society think about Jesus, but what do they individually think about the person of Jesus? Who do they think he is? Well, it's Peter who jumps in, and he says, "You are the Christ." Now, those words just don't strike us with the impact that they ought to, I don't think. The kind of impact they would have had if someone had been there at the time and heard Peter say it. The kind of impact that Peter's words would have had on the 12 when he said those words, "You are the Christ." I mean, that means you are the Messiah. You're the long-promised one. The one promised throughout all of the pages of the Old Testament scriptures. The one whom God for centuries promised would come to put things right. The one who would bring the reign of God himself to earth. That's what Peter is saying. And I suspect that the 12, as they heard those words from Peter, had their hearts leap or stop or bursting out of their chests. Perhaps he is. Perhaps he is the Christ. In verse 30, Jesus replies, and it says, Jesus warned them. Now, that word warned is a very strong word. It's a command. It's the same word as used for what Jesus said to the wind and the waves, to be quiet and be still. And it's a word that we're about to hear again in a sentence or so. Jesus warned them, commanded them not to tell anyone about him. You can imagine, if you like, Jesus turning around and looking at each one of them in the eye and saying, "Don't tell anyone. It's true, but don't tell a soul. No one is to be told for the time being." Because, as we're about to see, they had no idea what it actually meant. What expectations came into their minds as they heard that news? He could be the Christ. The one who God is going to bring into the world to put everything right. Well, if you met a person like that, what would you expect them to do? Well, the disciples and we need to understand what the one who God had sent to put everything right in the world actually needed to do. And so we move into verse 31 and start hearing about Jesus' mission. He began to teach them. Now that they had, for the first time, begun to grasp who Jesus is, he began to teach them for the first time what he had come to do. He began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's Jesus' favourite expression or title for himself, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must Notice these words and weigh them very carefully, friends. Jesus is telling them what he must do. Not just what he will do. This is not a mere prediction. This is talking about in the purposes of God. This is what has been promised by God's revelation through the Scriptures and therefore must happen. This is what he must do. Now, what would you expect him to say next? What expectations are right to expect someone like that to come and do? I mean, without reading on, and maybe you've been a Christian for a long time, so just shut out what you know for a second. What would you expect Jesus to go on to say next? If Jesus is the Christ, if Jesus is the one who has the kind of power he has already demonstrated, if Jesus is at the centre of what all of history is all about, if he is the one who has the power to put things right, if ultimately he is the one who has the key for every question that ever puzzled us, particularly questions that start with why, if he is the Christ, what would you expect him to do for you? And Jesus goes on and says he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Now, friends, that is not what we are looking for, is it? It might be what we expect now that we're familiar with our Bibles, but it's not really what we're looking for, is it? When you got involved with Christianity, I suspect you're looking for any number of things you want Christianity to do for you. When we have been Christians for a while, we expect Christianity to deliver certain things, whether it's health and healing or a feeling of well-being, a degree of comfort and security, a group of nice friends, a contact list of people who will really help out if I need it. But this is what Jesus came to do. He must suffer many things and be rejected. He must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And Mark adds in verse 32, he spoke plainly about this. At last, Jesus is not speaking in parables anymore, but I wonder if you sympathise with Peter and what he goes on to do. He takes Jesus aside, out of earshot of the other disciples so that they wouldn't hear, and Peter begins to rebuke, to take Jesus to task. And that word that Jesus has used before of warning his disciples is what is used of what Peter does now with Jesus. Listen, Jesus, it can't be like this. If I'm right and you're the Christ, don't muck it up by thinking it's got to do with suffering and rejection and being killed. If you're the Christ, then for goodness sake, get it right. We've seen the kind of power you've got. We've seen the kind of impact you can have on people. What are you talking about with this suffering and rejection and death stuff? You should stop it. See, Peter couldn't believe that suffering, rejection and death could possibly be the destiny of this man he'd just given the title Christ. And once again, we have difficulty, I think, because in our context and culture, we miss the importance of this. I suspect that our familiarity with the Jesus story means that, yes, we understand that. But friends, don't you and I have difficulty understanding that suffering and rejection and death is our lot? Has it ever happened that that someone you know and love has suffered and they've been rejected and maybe they've died and have you just accepted it because that's just the way things are? Perhaps you recognise Peter's words might be a little bit like our own words, perhaps in our prayers. I've read the stories, Jesus, about the amazing things you can do. So how about some of that power rather than the weakness stuff? Use some of that power we know you've got to stop Christians getting killed in Iran or in North Korea, or getting sued, or fearing dismissal from work for acting according to our beliefs. How dare you speak about yourself suffering and being rejected and dying? Can you see that when push comes to shove, we really don't expect Jesus to be the person who suffers and dies in rejection any more than Peter did? I want you to make my mum better. Don't you dare talk about suffering and dying, Jesus. I want you to help me with my depression, with my children, with my loneliness, with my powerlessness, with my work, with my unemployment. How dare you talk about the Christ suffering and dying? What good could that do? That's what Peter asks. And I think that we would ask too, if we'd been there. But see how Jesus responds. Turning around and seeing the other disciples, and whether they'd heard what Peter said or whether Jesus could see that they were thinking it too, Jesus takes Peter to task. Quite a conversation this, isn't it? People taken to task first on one side and then on the other, firm words flying everywhere. Jesus says, verse 33, "Get behind me, Satan," he said. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. If you're going to follow me, Peter, then you've got to remember your place. You are not the leader. You are not the one who sets the agenda for me to follow, says Jesus. You need to get behind me. You need to get back in your place. And if you try to take over, if you think you know better, if you're the one who sits and demands things that Jesus must fulfill, if you're going to set out the requirements that Jesus must live up to, if you begin to suggest that Jesus' mission is something other than, or bigger than, or better than, or more impressive one than his suffering and his rejection, his death, then you are speaking for the devil himself. I mean, they're harsh words, but only because they're so important. Peter is like the blind man in the story immediately before this, who Jesus heals in two stages. First, he is seeing, but not very clearly. Peter gets Jesus' title right, but he doesn't see what it means. He doesn't recognise the Christ Jesus knows he must be. He needs to listen to Jesus so that Peter can see who Jesus really is and what it really means for Jesus to be the Christ. It is only when we recognise the identity, the real identity of Jesus, and understand the mission of Jesus, the real mission of Jesus, that we will know how to respond to him. What a life of a Christian faith looks like. And so Jesus turns on to describe what it means to be one of Jesus' followers. Look at verse 34. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever will save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. Friends, if Jesus is the Christ, and if his mission was to suffer, to be rejected and to die, if that is what he's come to do, if that is the way that he puts things right before rising to life again, then to follow him, then to take him seriously, to be involved with him, cannot be a small, light, insignificant add-on to our lives. It can't be that life just goes on as it has always gone on, with just a bit of an interest in Christianity tucked on the side. As if we could one day say, well, for a few years I was interested in that. No, that's not Christian faith, friends. Listen to Jesus' words again. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself. Well, what does that mean? It means you must deny what yourself is always saying. And what is myself? What is yourself always saying? It is saying that I am the most important person in the world. That my life is my life to live my way. But Jesus says, if anyone comes after me, he must deny himself. take up his cross and follow. It's a call to costly discipleship, where if we were asked to carry the crossbeam of our own shameful execution, it would be just the kind of thing we'd expect, and we would do it. And the reason is, according to Jesus, that life which we so value is something that we can only really gain by letting go of it. Verse 35, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it. I mean, one option for us through life is the option taken by most people. It's to take life and hold on to it because it's yours. Take your life and grasp it for yourself. Hold on tight. Live it for yourself, ultimately. Of course, you might live it for others too, but you only do that because of the happiness it brings you. Live your life for yourself. Hold on to your life for yourself. For how long? For how long will you be able to hold on to your life for yourself? Not long. Not long at all. You know it will be taken away from you, don't you? Very soon, really. But Jesus says, read on, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. Give up your self-directed life for Christ and for the gospel, and he will give you life, eternal life. See how blind we are? Isn't it strange how hard it is for this to sink in? We start thinking, this is a hard message we're hearing. But listen to Jesus' reasoning in verse 36, and it makes perfect sense. For what good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul, forfeit their life? Or what can a man give in exchange for their soul, for their life? Friends, just imagine you do it, as most of us at one level or another are trying to do. Imagine you indeed gain the whole world. Just imagine that you got all of it. Not just keeping what you have now, not just being among the super rich. Just imagine that you are actually able to gain the whole world. It's yours. You make people like Bernard Arnault, the CEO of Louis Vuitton, Moet and Hennessy, who is currently the most wealthy man in the world, or Jeff Bezos, or Elon Musk, or Mark Zuckerberg, or Bill Gates, or Larry Page, and Sergey Brin. They look like paupers compared to you, because everything they have is really just yours. What good is that to you? What good is that success on the day you die? Are any of us stupid enough to think that we can purchase eternal life, even with that wealth? You know we can't. Then what good will it do to gain the whole world and lose our life? If Jesus Christ gives eternal life to those who follow him, is there anything that makes sense to cling on to as an alternative to following him? Jesus goes on in verse 38, if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. I think that modern people think that being ashamed of Jesus is just that it's embarrassing being associated with something that's a bit old-fashioned or out of date. And I'm sure that sometimes we might feel a bit like that. When people find out you go to church and say, you do what? Oh, that's a bit old-fashioned. It's in this modern age. We sort of left that in the past. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. It's not because we live in a modern world that we might be ashamed of Christ. It's because we live in a sinful world, a world that devotes itself to what Peter was trying to do, trying to make Jesus what they want him to be, a noble religious leader, a guru alongside others like the Buddha, or pagan influences, or a failed revolutionary, an inspiration to be moral and to be nice to others. That is what it means to be ashamed of Jesus, to refuse to accept his true identity, to refuse to accept his true mission. This is the world's attitude today, isn't it? It treats Jesus and Christianity as if it's a bit embarrassing. The big thing that Jesus did was suffer, to be rejected and die on the cross. And so they find another place for him, another importance for him. It's that kind of ashamed, thinking that what Jesus says here he must do is really just a bit feeble and needs a bit more impressiveness associated with it to make a real world impact. Sadly, friends, there are some around who even call themselves followers of Jesus who have been deceived and act like Peter does here. They act as if they're ashamed of the suffering of Jesus and the self-denying life that he calls us to. And so they create a false Jesus who is all about getting an easier life or healing from sickness or more success at work or better income or children or a husband or a wife or a relief from loneliness. But Jesus knows what we need better than we do. Remember that account back in Mark chapter 2? That man who couldn't walk and his friends who thought his greatest need was to be able to walk again? But Jesus saw that what he really needed was his sins forgiven. Friends, if we think like the world, then we will be tempted to be ashamed of being associated with the real Jesus, ashamed of speaking the message of the real Jesus, probably due to pride. Peter was ashamed to go to Jerusalem with a man who would suffer and be rejected and be killed. Well, Peter, if you are too proud to have him as your Lord and Saviour, the day will come, says Jesus, when I will be ashamed of you. Friends, for the disciples, Jerusalem was ahead of them in time. They're just beginning to grasp what is going to happen. We're in a different situation. We are looking back at what has happened, and it's happened just as Jesus said it would, just as Jesus said it must. He did suffer many things. He was rejected, and he was put to death, and he did rise. And we look back and realize that that was for us. In the purposes of God, Jesus took onto himself our sin and our guilt, and that is why he suffered and died. And it's not just those who travelled with him on the road to Jerusalem that he called to follow him. The news goes out into all the world that Jesus, the Christ, is the one who was rejected and killed, who rose again, and he's calling on men and women everywhere to come and follow him. The colleagues that you are going to meet later in the day today, or send emails to, the family you're going to go home to, or you are maybe already at home with and in the next room, or your neighbours, the people across the street. The message from the real Jesus is come and follow him. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.